Let's get on with our main event right now. You guys are going to enjoy this. This is Jeffrey Sussman, who is the author of Boxing and the Mob.
There was a very direct dealing between mob guy and fighter. In those days, the mob guys held a special place they no longer hold. And so a certain amount of reverence built up around him. Now you take a fighter who really, particularly in those days, I mean, you're not going to see too many Harvard and Yale fellows entering that business. It's very hard to get hit all the time. These were kids, tough kids who needed the money, who saw it as a way out of the particular ghetto that they were involved in, and the mob was a natural for them.
Welcome back to the Ringside Boxing Show on the Grueling Truth Sports Network. I'm Dennis Taylor with John J. Responte, and we are really excited about today's featured guest. Jeffrey Sussman is the author of, I think, about 13 nonfiction books, including Max Baer and Barney Ross and Rocky Graziano, Fist, Fame, and Fortune. He was on our show to talk about that book probably a couple of years ago. His latest work is called Boxing and the Mob, The Notorious History of the Sweet Science, which will be released, I think, Wednesday by Rowman and Littlefield. So by the time you hear this, it might even already be out. And that's the same company that published the book that John and I wrote, Intimate Warfare, The True Story of the Arturo Gatti and Mickey Ward Boxing Trilogy. Boxing and the Mob is already getting raves from reviewers who received an advance copy, and I'm going to give it another one right here. I read it this week, and it is fascinating. It's one of the many things I really loved about it was that Jeffrey Sussman put together a lot of smaller individual biographies and weaved together stories of a whole bunch of badass gangsters and snakes and quite literally Damon Runyon characters. And Jeffrey, you put them all together in a really seamless narrative that's a whole bunch of fun to read. And if you happen to be a junkie of true stories about seedy underworld thugs and nasty, greedy, heartless, sociopathic bastard grifters, as I am and as John is, people are going to love this book. So congrats, you've done it again. How you been, man?
I've been very well, thank you, and I appreciate the fine words you just said about my book.
Well, it's a real pleasure.
I second that, Jeffrey. I got to read a lot of your book too, and it's excellent. Super job.
And you know, as authors ourselves, we're always curious about why a topic was chosen. But you explain a little bit about that in the intro to the book. Tell our audience about your great uncle Irving.
Yeah, I met him only once when I was 13 years old. My father introduced me to him, and he handed me a wad of money, which I was surprised about getting from him. And I never saw him again. But afterwards, I asked my father about him, and he said that during the Depression, my father's family was rather poor during the Depression, and Irving had made a ton of money as a bootlegger during Prohibition and had a big estate in upstate New York next to the governor's mansion. And my father visited him on 2 occasions, and he wouldn't give any financial aid to my father's family, but what he did do is he would give him advice on which boxing matches to bet on that were fixed. A number of them were matches with Primo Carnera. And my father said to me, he said, bet $75 on this match and you'll walk away with either $750 or $1,000. And he did that several times a year.
Wow.
Man. Well, Boxing and the Mob is a journey through American boxing history, I'll call it, and also American mobster history, essentially from the time of Jack Dempsey to through the Sonny Liston era. And most fans are at least peripherally familiar with the Black Sox scandal when a gambler fixed the 1919 World Series. What they might not know is that the guy who rigged the series that year moved on to even uglier things. He essentially gave birth to organized crime in this country, and along the way he also corrupted professional boxing in a pretty profound way. Give us a feel for who Arnold Rothstein was and also who Abe Attell was, and how those guys changed the sweet science for decades.
Well, Arnold Rothstein was a brilliant mind. He was known as the brain and the big bankroll. He was able to put together all sorts of schemes and devices all of which were illegal, to make a lot of money. And he became the mentor of the men who really organized crime in America in the 20th century. He mentored, as a group, Bugsy Siegel, Meyer Lansky, Lucky Luciano, and Frank Costello, all of whom were boyhood friends. And he taught them everything that they needed to know about how to organize crime and corrupt basically whatever they got involved in. Now, Abe Attell, who had been the featherweight boxing champion, I believe it was from 1906 to 1912, became a friend of Arnold Rothstein and was sort of his bag man. It was from Arnold Rothstein that Abe Attell got money to bribe the what were called the Black Sox players in throwing the 1919 World Series. But then after that event, especially because of all the negative publicity they got, Abe Attell and Arnold Rothstein realized it would be a lot easier to corrupt boxing and fix a boxing match than a baseball game, because there were just a lot fewer players that you had to bribe and depend upon.
Interesting. Hey, Damien Runyon, the legendary American writer and sports writer and playwright, is a reoccurring character in your book. Explain why, Jeffrey.
Well, Damon Runyon loved the underworld. He loved these characters, and he got very involved as a friend of first Arnold Rothstein. He was a friend of Abe Attell. He knew all these gangsters from the 1920s and the 1930s, and his the famous play Guys and Dolls, which he was responsible for, is based on all of these real life gangster characters.
Yeah, let's see. Dave the Dude. Who was Dave the Dude modeled on?
I think Dave the Dude was. I'm trying to remember now, but I know that Nathan Detroit was to some extent based on Arnold Rothstein. And he was the big gambler, and Arnold Rothstein was the big gambler. I can't recall exactly which character Dave the Dude was based on.
It might have been Owney Madden.
That's right.
Oh.
Yeah. I think you're right about that. I think it was Owney Madden.
Okay.
And Owney Madden was an interesting character. He came from England and settled on the west side of Manhattan in what was then called Hell's Kitchen, and associated with Irish gangsters, and made a fortune during Prohibition. And after Prohibition, he was looking around for another way to make money, and he came across Primo Carnera, who had been brought to this country by a French boxing manager whose last name was S-E-E. And he basically took Primo Carnera away from him and wound up fixing all of Carnera's fights. And Carnera didn't even know his fights were being fixed. He thought he was actually winning these bouts.
Yeah, and John is a big movie historian and stuff, and I know one of John's favorite movies is The Harder They Fall.
Right, based on Primo Carnera. What a lot of people don't know about Owney Madden is after he retired from being a mobster, he settled in Hot Springs, Arkansas, and he opened a kind of a resort for retiring mobsters and mobsters on the lam. And in his last years, he became quite ill. And the nurse that took care of him every day was Bill Clinton's mother.
Man,
wow, that is a story.
So the famous Hollywood actor George Raft, who usually played a gangster, was a guy who kind of wandered through the underworld and the boxing world and the entertainment world all at the same time. And you've got a great story in your book, one that I hadn't heard before, about James Cagney and Raft and this weasel Owney Madden, who basically created Primo Carnera, or had a big Carnera and had a big role in it at least. Explain what happened to Cagney and how George Raft and Owney Madden figured in.
Well, Raft started out as a protege of Owney Madden, and when Owney Madden ran a New York gang called the Gophers, George Raft, whose real last name was Ranft, used to go up onto the roofs of tenement buildings with Owney Madden and throw bricks down on the cops. and loved Owney Madden and wanted to be a gangster like Owney Madden, and he kind of wandered into show business almost by accident. He was a dancing gigolo, and that was pretty much how he made his money.
Yeah.
And movie career just happened accidentally. But while he was in Hollywood, he befriended James Cagney, who played gangsters in so many movies. And for some reason, there was a contract out on Cagney's life, and he was terrified. And he went to George Raft, and he asked him if there was anything he could do to help him. And Raft said, "I'll speak to Owney Madden, and we'll get the contract on you removed." And Cagney was forever grateful to him for that.
John, had you ever heard that story before about Cagney?
Yes, I have. And you know, of course, that George Raft was good friends with Bugsy Siegel while he was in Hollywood, and right, Jeffrey, and I mean they were pretty darn good friends, and a lot of people didn't like it, but George Raft was pretty loyal. From something I read about George Raft, he gave a lot of these guys money, and they never even paid him back, but he was in no position to say, "Hey, where's my money?" It was just one of those kind of deals, but that was in the 30s. You know, have you ever heard that about George Raft and Bugsy Siegel? I'm sure you read something during research.
Absolutely, they were great friends. They had met in New York, where they hung out with a lot of the same people. And but you're right. If you lent Bugsy Siegel money, don't expect to ask for the money to be repaid. Either he would ignore you or shoot you.
Yeah, it was like his friendship was what he repaid you with. That was basically what it was. You know, like that.
Yeah, he would do any favor in the world for you, including kill someone for you, but he wouldn't part with money.
Yeah, and you'd repay him eventually for that favor.
Exactly.
Yeah. Gosh.
Well, you brought up Primo Carnera, and I want to ask you a few questions about that, because I've read some things about him that, I mean, most of his fights were fixes. I read that. Some of them weren't. They put him in fights where he was obviously the bigger man and everything. Tell me, was there anything about, I mean, you know, anybody who knows boxing history and everything knows the Primo story, and was there anything about him that while you were doing your research that you discovered and you went, how about that?
Well, there were a few things. One, he did have an inclination, you know, that he wasn't as good as he was led to believe, and he discovered that when Owney Madden hired Abe Attell to train Primo Carnera for a fight, to teach him some of the more basic elements of boxing that Primo didn't know, and Primo also developed a terrific respect and admiration for Max Baer, who defeated him for the World Championship. And because Owney Madden and his mob dumped Primo Carnera after he lost the fight to Max Baer, and he was badly beaten in that bout. He had a broken jaw, 3 broken ribs, and I think a bone in one of his arms. Jeez. And Max Baer felt so responsible for this that he paid all of Owney Madden's hospital bills. And when Max Baer died, Owney Madden was in Italy and couldn't get to California for the funeral. But when he did get to California a week later, he had his driver take him to the cemetery where Max Baer was buried. And it was late at night, and the cemetery gates were closed, and he and his driver climbed over the fence and found Max Baer's gravestone, and Primo knelt down and crossed himself and said a prayer, and when he got up, he said to his driver that Max Baer was the best friend that he ever had in boxing.
Oh, wow.
Wow. That's incredible. That doesn't surprise me about Max Baer, because he had a big heart, and that was the thing Primo showed. You know this better than anyone, Jeffrey. I mean, man, Max Baer kept knocking him down, but he kept getting up. Yeah. So you can say a lot about him, but he had a big heart and his big body.
He had a big heart, and he had a lot of courage, and also Max Baer was the one who arranged for Primo to have a wrestling career after Owney Madden and his thugs stole all of his money.
Wow. Great guy.
Do you think that's the scene the scene that's in Requiem for a Heavyweight right at the end? Is that based on Primo also?
Well, refresh my memory about that last scene.
Anthony Quinn's boxing career is over, and Mickey Rooney and Jackie Gleason get him into wrestling, and it's actually a really sad scene at the end. You know, it's embarrassing for Anthony Quinn, which I guess Primo kind of thrived in that. He made a lot of money as a wrestler.
Primo loved it. I mean, in the movie, you're right. He does seem deeply embarrassed by having to put on this act of being a wrestler, but it appealed to Primo because, you know, before Primo became a boxer, he was a circus strongman, and he used to perform acts in a circus that he enjoyed doing, and wrestling reminded him of that.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Wow. Okay, let's talk about Mike Jacobs, who, again, if you know boxing history and you know about the people that were running things in those days, he was a very interesting kind of not the nicest guy in the world, and nobody got a meaningful fight in boxing unless they went through Mike Jacobs, and you played by his rules. Who was Mike Jacobs? Give us a little background on that guy.
Well, Mike Jacobs was probably the most unlikable guy in boxing. A couple of years ago, when I was giving a talk about my Max Baer Barney Ross book, Mike Jacobs' niece came to hear me, and afterwards she said to me, you know, none of his relatives liked him. They all disliked him. They thought he was a miserable person.
Well,
which I found very amusing. But he was a guy who came out of real dire poverty. He was very clever at putting together deals. He began selling newspapers on the street and then selling candy to people going on boat excursion trips. He worked himself up and was promoting events at Madison Square Garden and eventually got himself into boxing promotions. And he was a friend of Damon Runyon, and at one point they actually had a company with a third partner, and they were making so much money that Mike Jacobs, who was very greedy, wound up pushing Damon Runyon and the other partner out of the business and took it over himself. And he made a deal also with Madison Square Garden and Joe Louis, that he would get 10% of all of Joe Louis's earnings as long as Joe Louis remained the heavyweight champion.
Yeah, he was something else.
And you know, he wasn't pushed out of boxing until after he had a couple of strokes, and then Frankie Carbo came in and took over what Mike Jacobs had been doing and made it really corrupt on a much larger level.
Fascinating. What about Jacobs Beach, Jeffrey? Tell us about that. What was it?
Well, that was a little store, actually, out of which Mike Jacobs operated. And all these boxers and promoters would always be hanging around in front of the place. And I think it was Damon Runyon who said it was like a beach out there. And it became known as Jacobs Beach. And what it really was just a little ticket store on the west side of Manhattan, just west of Broadway.
We had Angelo Dundee on this show about 3 years ago, and one of the stories he told us, I asked him if he ever ran into any of these wise guy types, and he said, yeah. He said, I was in an elevator in Florida, and the guy who got in the elevator with me was Frankie Carbo, and he said, I knew who he was because I'd seen him at the fights, and I'd seen his picture in the paper and stuff. So we're riding up the elevator, and I looked at him, and I said, hey, I know you for somewhere, don't I? And he said, Carbo looked at him with these shark eyes and said, you don't know me. And that was the end of it. Along comes Carbo. He was part of Murder Incorporated.
Supposedly he killed about 19 people as a member of Murder Incorporated.
Wow. And actually was convicted one time, right? Cab driver.
He was convicted of killing a taxi driver from whom he tried to get money for a protection racket that he was running, and the taxi driver wouldn't go along with it, so he just shot him. So
they sent him to Sing Sing, and how long did he spend there?
A couple of years, I think it was, and he was a model prisoner, and he got out after a shorter period of time for good behavior.
Murder Incorporated was essentially an association of hitmen for hire, right?
Yeah, there were about 100 members of it. It was a hit team that was run by two gangsters, Albert Anastasia and Lepke Buchalter. Mm-hmm. And Lepke Buchalter was eventually convicted of ordering the hit on a number of different people, and he was the only organized crime boss in the history of organized crime who was electrocuted in the electric chair at Sing Sing prison.
No kidding. Wow. So Jacobs has a cerebral hemorrhage. He's the guy running boxing. And that's when Carbo swooped in, right? And kind of took over the boxing world.
Right. Carbo was also looking around for something where he could make a lot of money very quickly, and he had been continued to be involved in hits even after he took over boxing. One of the mafia bosses of New Jersey, a man named Ralph Natali, reported that it was well known in mafia circles that Frankie Carbo was the one who actually shot and killed Bugsy Siegel.
Mm.
Yeah.
Wow.
And yet Bugsy Siegel and Frankie Carbo had been involved together in Murder Incorporated, almost as partners, where they committed a lot of murders themselves.
So Carbo kind of ruled boxing in a way different way than Jacobs did. He did it through fear and intimidation, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, Jacobs didn't have that capacity to intimidate people. He was very deceptive and manipulative, but Carbo was very direct, and he worked with a man named Frank Blinky Palermo, and the two of them, could scare you to death. If you didn't go along with them, they'd threaten to rip your eyes out, to batter your head down with a baseball bat, to do anything they could to get you to sign a contract.
And one of the guys who didn't go along with him, stood up to him, was the great trainer, Ray Arcel. What happened to him?
Yeah.
Well, Frankie Carbo and a man named Jim Norris, who had an ownership position at Madison Square Garden at that time, were the ones who were really producing the Friday night fights in New York and also the Wednesday night fights. Now, Ray Arcel, who had been a very good trainer, decided that he would produce televised fights, though his would come from Boston on Saturday night. And Frankie Carbo's minions went to Ray Arcel and said, "You can't do this, you've got to stop." And he refused to do it, refused to go along with them, and then they threatened to kill him. And he didn't believe it. He just kept doing it. And then one night on his way to the Boston Arena to see one of his fighters, a guy came up behind him with a lead pipe wrapped in a newspaper and hit him over the head and fractured his skull. And he almost died. He was in the hospital for several weeks, but he got the message, and he quit boxing for, I think it was 17 or 18 years, until Roberto Duran's manager begged him to become Roberto Duran's trainer. And he did that without getting paid. He didn't want to get paid.
Wow.
He did it because he just wanted to get back in the game.
And I might be backing up a few years too, but something similar happened to Benny Leonard, right?
Well, Benny Leonard lost all of his money in the Depression, and had to go back to fighting. And he was really kind of old and washed up by then. And he had been a great fighter before then, and took a lot of terrible beatings. But then to make money, he also had to become a referee. And I think it was in 1947 or so, around then, that while refereeing a boxing match in Queens, New York, he dropped dead in the ring of a heart attack.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. One of the most infamous fixed fights, and we all saw it depicted in Raging Bull, was when Jake LaMotta took a really less convincing dive against Billy Fox.
Right.
It was something he did to set himself up for a world title shot that had been out of reach to him previously because of this culture where the mob ran everything. Tell the story of LaMotta versus Fox.
Well, everyone thought that Jake LaMotta should have been the middleweight boxing champion. He was one of the toughest ring opponents around. And but if you wanted to get a title fight at Madison Square Garden, you had to sign on with Frankie Carbo and Frank Palermo, and he didn't want to do that. He knew a lot of mob guys, and he associated with a lot of mob guys, but he knew that if he signed on with them, that they would own him, and he didn't want to be owned by anybody. He wanted to be his own person. And he continued fighting, and he fought out of New York and in club fights and all over the place, but they wouldn't give him a title bout. And finally, he got so disgusted that he agreed with Frankie Carbo to take a dive in a fight with Billy Fox. And Frankie Carbo said, "Look, you want to make a lot of money on this fight? Bet against yourself. Bet for Billy Fox." And he did. I can't remember if it was $100,000. I think that he bet. And he really cleaned up on that. But then he had to have 4 or 5 additional fights before Carbo would give him a shot at the title. And then he fought Marcel Cerdan and won that fight and became the middleweight champ. But he was not a nice guy. I recently was speaking to Rocky Graziano's daughter, and she told me that Jake would often come and visit them, and her mother couldn't stand Jake. She just thought he was a lousy human being and didn't want to have anything to do with him. But her father, Rocky Graziano, loved Jake. They had been friends since they met in reform school when they were teenagers. And often Jake was looking for opportunities to make money, and since Rocky was having a very successful career in television, he often got Jake parts in movies and on TV programs, for which Jake was very grateful.
Wow. Hey, Jeffrey, since you read that book about Rocky Graziano and you know a little bit about Jake LaMotta, too, I got to ask you, they almost fought once, and I think an injury canceled that one. If they had ever fought each other, Jake LaMotta and Rocky Graziano, who do you think would have won?
I think Jake would have. But I think it would have been really close. It would have been very difficult, I think for, not so much for Jake, but I think it would have been very difficult for Rocky to fight Jake because he liked him so much. And there were a couple of cases where Rocky went easy on other opponents whom he liked. I mean, he would win, but he wouldn't go all out and try to kill them the way he did in some of his bouts.
Yeah.
That one would have been bloody, though. Oh, baby.
Yeah, well, sure. Yeah. Well, you mentioned this guy a little bit, and I want to talk a little bit more about. I want you to talk a little bit about him. The infamous Blinky Palermo, another charming associate of Frankie Carbo. Tell us a little bit more about Blinky. How did he know? How I forgot now, or I forget, but he was associated with Frankie Carbo, obviously. But how did he weasel his way into and become like Carbo's right-hand man?
Well, he started out. He was known as the numbers king of Philadelphia, and he was a member of the Philadelphia mob family, and they had a lot of associations with various New York mob families, and he also owned a boxing gym, I believe, in Philadelphia, and he owned some boxers, and he wanted those boxers to go on and become champs as well, and have title fights. And it was just a thing where these two guys' interests coalesced, and they found that they could benefit each other, and also because Frankie Carbo had a criminal record, he couldn't be licensed in New York as a manager, and he needed front people to manage for him. And initially, Palermo was able to do that. And then there was another a guy from Pennsylvania named Jaime the Mink Wallman, his name was, who was also a manager. And it's very interesting. I had a friend a number of years ago. He's a retired stockbroker, and he and his brother were the managers of an up-and-coming middleweight in the 1980s. And they had a small training camp in Pennsylvania, and their fighter was sparring with an opponent there. And one day, Frank Palermo and Jaime Wallman arrived at the training camp, and they said to them, in effect, he's no longer your fighter, he's our fighter. And with a few threats, they took the fighter away from him.
Palermo was a little guy, right? He was only a little over 5 feet tall. Was he?
Yeah, he was maybe 5'2", but he was a menace.
Was he a leg breaker? Was he a killer? Was he anything like that?
Yeah. He had a very violent temper. He couldn't control it, and you know, he was like a mad dog in a way. So you know, a mad dog can be a small little dog, but it can still take quite a bite out of your leg.
The Joe Pesci character.
Yeah, look at Joe Pesci, right?
Yeah. Same size, yeah. Yeah. You know, I thought of this question when Dennis and I were talking about what to ask you, and I know that I think I remember that Frankie Carbo was involved with Johnny Saxton in the late 40s and 50s. He one of them, I'm not sure which one of them, stole his contract away and set up Saxon for some of his fights with Carmen Basilio and things like that. But this is a kind of a hard one, but I'm curious, with all your research and all you know about boxing, Jeffrey, if you could give like a ballpark figure of how many fights you think Carbo and Palermo were able to fix in the 40s and 50s.
Gee, I would just be taking a guess, but I would guess somewhere around 30 fights.
Okay.
And Frankie Palermo owned the contract on Saxton.
That's right. Yeah, and they pretty much discarded him after he lost the third fight to Basilio, and his life was just terrible.
Awful.
And these guys didn't care. Yeah. These guys didn't care, right? It was just like discarded them.
Yeah, you saw that with Primo Carnera and Saxton and others. And Billy Fox, as soon as these guys could no longer turn a buck for them, they became useless and they were discarded.
Wow.
They were thrown away like a used tissue.
Yeah.
This is the Ringside Boxing Show from Monterey, California. I'm Dennis Taylor with John J. Risponti. We're talking to Jeffrey Sussman, whose brand new book is Boxing and the Mob, The Notorious History of the Sweet Science. Okay, so John and I have a mutual friend, Carl Sigmund, who hung out at the Olympic for a while when he lived in L.A., and he gave me this little snapshot of ringside, and sitting right on the ring apron is Mickey Cohen. What about Mickey Cohen and Bugsy Siegel? How involved were they in boxing underworld?
Well, Mickey Cohen started out as a boxer in Chicago.
Right.
And eventually he had to leave Chicago because his criminality was catching up with him. And when Bugsy Siegel was sent out to Los Angeles to run the racing wire and gambling out there, he needed an assistant, in effect. And Mickey Cohen, who was a terrific thug, appealed to Bugsy Siegel, and when Bugsy Siegel needed someone threatened or needed someone to take care of something for him, he calls on Mickey Cohen to do it. Mickey Cohen supposedly threatened the life of Jack Dragna, who was head of the mob in Los Angeles before Bugsy Siegel got there.
Jeez. So Jeffrey, you're a New York native. As a younger person, how aware were you of wise guy mafia underworld people in that city? How did were those guys intimidating thugs in your day when you were growing up? Were they local bad boy celebrities? Were they envied for their wealth and power and pretty women and respect they evoked because they were feared, or were they just reviled?
I think all of that is true. Other than meeting my father's uncle Irving, my other encounter with a gangster who was very powerful at the time. I used to work for my father on Saturday mornings. My father had a garment factory, and he used to take me there on Saturday mornings when I would sweep up the floor, and I would carry bolts of cloth up from the basement to what was called a cutter's table, where they would be unrolled and patterns would be cut for ladies' dresses. I was coming up from the basement one Saturday morning carrying a bolt of cloth on my shoulder, and I hear my father and another man screaming and yelling at each other. And when I got up to where the cutter's table was, I looked down, and I saw these two men. They looked as if they were coming to blows. My father's fists were clenched. He had one fist raised like he was going to throw a punch. And when he shouted at this guy, spittle came out of his mouth. And then the guy pointed at my father, and he said, "We're going to get you, you son of a bitch." And he left. And I asked my father on the way home what that was all about. And he said that was a notorious New York gangster named Johnny Dio, who controlled illegal unions and the trucking business in New York. And he wanted to unionize my father's workers, and the workers voted against unionization because they would have wound up getting less pay than if they had stayed union free. And they all, Johnny Dio also wanted my father to use his trucking company. And about a week later, my parents had taken me out for dinner to celebrate my birthday. And when we got home later that evening, our home had been broken into, and everything in the kitchen was smashed. You know, they emptied the refrigerator and they threw fruit against the wall, and they poured out containers of milk, and the place looked like a mess. And I discovered later on from a policeman neighbor of ours that this had been a message from Johnny Dio that my father better go along, or this was just the beginning of what he would face. And my mother had a cousin who had some mob connections. He was sort of a shady kind of character, and he was able to negotiate a deal between my father and Johnny Dio's trucking company, so there was no further acts of violence. But that was a real eye-opener for me in how the mob operated.
And you were like 13, 14 years old when that happened, right? That must have been chilling.
Yeah, it was. I was stunned by it. I just stood there speechless.
Wow, what a story!
Back in those days, if somebody went to a fight at Madison Square Garden, Jeffrey, were they likely to see those wise guys? I mean, were they sitting right there and easy to spot?
Oh yeah, I think so, definitely. You know, I was talking about 4 weeks ago to Jerry Cooney, and he liked my book very much, and he said, boxing and the mob, the two always went together. You know, they were always interchangeable, especially in New York.
Yeah. Wow.
Sonny Liston was always viewed as a mob-connected fighter. Both of his losses to Ali the former Cassius Clay were viewed as suspicious. The first one because of the liniment-type substance that Clay somehow got into his eyes, especially the second fight, the Phantom Punch fight, with the shady knockout. What's your opinion of the level of the mob's influence on Sonny Liston, and what do you think happened in the Phantom Punch fight?
I think that Sonny Liston was controlled by the mob ever since he was a late teenager, 18 or 19 years old. That was his life. In the first fight, I think he was prepared to take a dive, but he did seriously injure his arm because it was examined afterwards, and they discovered that he had bled into the muscles in his upper arm and in his forearm, and that's why he really couldn't move it. In the second fight, the one with the Phantom Punch, a gangster from Ohio named John Vitale, who owned a piece of Sonny Liston, told a friend, "Don't bother going up to Lewiston to see the fight because it'll be over before you get there." And a gambler in Las Vegas named Ash Resnick, who was a friend of Sonny Liston and also owned a piece of Sonny Liston, when a friend of his said that he wanted to fly up to Lewiston, Maine to see the fight, Ash Resnick said almost the same thing that John Vitale said. He just said, the fight will be over in the first round. It's not worth your going there.
Wow.
And you know, when Ollie was standing over Sonny Liston, who was rolling around on the canvas before he finally lay down flat on his back, he looked over at Sonny Liston and he said, "Get up, sucker. No one's going to believe this. No one's going to believe it."
Yeah.
And then when Ollie got back to his corner, he said to his cornerman, "Did I hit him? I don't think I hit him. Did I hit him?"
Really?
Wow. Great stuff.
So, you know, I don't think Ollie was in on any of this, but he was furious that it made him look like a fool.
Yeah.
Our late great friend Don Chargan, the legendary promoter, was one of those people who testified about the mob's influence on the sport, and he told us that it was really a frightening experience. And you know, the guys who didn't play ball got the hell beat out of them, like Ray Arcel,
right.
And there were many others. What did it take to ultimately break the underworld's grip on the sport?
Well, I think that when Robert Kennedy prosecuted Frankie Carvo and Frank Palermo and Jim Norris and some others, he sent a very strong message. You know that you guys can't do this anymore. You know, we're going to be watching you very carefully, and I think it changed the way that the mob thought of themselves as possibly being interested in boxing. There was an interesting testimony that I have in my book by Sammy Gravano to a Senate committee investigating corruption in boxing in 1993, and he said that if the mob were to get involved in boxing again, they would wind up probably owning the manager, and the fighter would never even know that his manager was owned by the mob, and they would build up a fighter by making sure that he had opponents that he could easily beat. And then when it came time to getting him ranked, let's say, as a contender, they would go to one of the sanctioning bodies and pay them to rank their man as a number one contender. He said at one point he did that, and I forgot which sanctioning body it was, and they wanted $10,000 to rank this fighter as a number one contender. And when Sammy Gravano mentioned John Gotti's name, the sanctioning body said, "Well, as a courtesy, we'll lower the fee to $5,000." And then he said, you know, these championship bouts, you know, they're worth tens and tens of millions of dollars, and that's where the real money lies. And you know, the television rights, the movie rights, whatever rights they can sell nationally and internationally are worth a lot more to them than fixing a fight, which is what used to go down in the old days. And it almost didn't matter who won the fight because of all the money involved.
Interesting. Was there anything that just, when you were doing your research, that really surprised you, Jeffrey, where you went, wow, that is really amazing stuff?
It surprised me that some people were treated so badly. There were a number of fighters who were really good fighters, who were forced to lose, and then their careers ended, and they didn't get anything. They were abandoned. There was a fighter who beat Rocky Graziano twice in the 1940s. His name was Steve Riggio, and you would have thought he would have gone on to have a great career, and instead he wound up as a taxi driver after he had these wins against Rocky Graziano. And his sons, by the way, are the ones who own and operate the Barnes & Noble bookstores.
Wow, really?
Yeah. And then there was another fighter named Henry Green, who beat Rocky twice and then lost the third time, and he claimed that he was forced to lose the third time, that he better lose or else.
And that was the fight. Wasn't that the fight where he got stopped in like the 10th round or something like that? Rocky stopped him in the 10th round. Harold Green, right?
I think that was the one. Yeah.
That's it. Yeah.
And then,
go ahead.
I'm sorry.
I said go ahead.
Oh, and then there was a guy named Harry Haft, and they're making a movie about him right now. He was it's a fascinating story. He was a prisoner in a World War II concentration camp, and he was forced to fight for the entertainment of the SS guards, and he won something like 70 fights in a concentration camp, and he came to New York after World War II, and he started having a successful career as a heavyweight boxer, and he was scheduled to fight Rocky Marciano, and two thugs came into his dressing room before the fight and told him he better lose or we're going to kill you.
Yeah.
And he lost, and that was the end of his fight career.
How much of that kind of thing, if any, obviously the mob is receded back into the shadows in a sense, but do you suspect that they could be involved in some of the some part of boxing even today? Sure.
Yeah.
Really.
But I think it'll be hidden. It'll be very circumspect.
Right.
Right. They certainly don't want anyone shining a spotlight on them.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I mean when I said they've gone back in the shadows. They would be involved in the money aspect, right? In some shadowy way. Is that what you're thinking?
Yeah, I mean, that's what attracts the mob is the money. It's not the sport so much, but it's also interesting to see how many different mob guys started out as boxers.
Yeah, and how many of them liked boxing? I mean, I know Al Capone really liked boxing, and he was somewhat kind of friends with Jack Dempsey.
And he was a very good friend of Barney Ross. He helped to begin Barney Ross's career as a young man. He hired a trainer for him and made sure that all the tickets for the fight were sold and that Barney Ross got a portion of that.
That's right. That was in your book. Yeah, that was interesting stuff. Yeah.
Who in this rogues gallery was Bobby Kennedy able to send to prison?
Frankie Carbo went to prison for 25 years and Frank Palermo for 15 years.
Okay.
Wow.
How much did you enjoy researching this book? It must have been a lot of fun. Really.
Oh, I loved doing it. It was fascinating reading this, and what was also fascinating was reading the FBI files on Frankie Carbo and Frank Palermo. I mean, they were enormous, and the number of crimes that they were suspected of it was staggering.
Gosh.
And what's also interesting is to read the FBI file on the last Ali fight. The FBI also said that last fight was fixed, the one with the phantom punch.
Really?
Yeah.
There you go.
That would be interesting stuff. Wow. Well, I always like to ask a writer what the next project is. man, I think if I were you, I'd never, I don't think there's ever been a great movie made about Carbo and Palermo and, Jacobs and all these guys in a boxing context, has there?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Yeah, might be a screenplay for you, man.
If you know anyone who's interested, let me know.
Okay.
I'll to write it.
We'll keep our ears open.
If you want to produce it, I'll write it.
All right. We're on it.
Yeah, John and I are just rolling in dough. We'll be executive producers.
Yes, right.
You know how this bestseller author stuff works out.
Exactly.
Gosh.
So, all right, John, got anything else?
No, not really. I did think of something just real quickly. I wanted to add something about my dad. You were talking about the mob, and my family was very involved in a way. When you were telling that incredible story about your father, my dad also knew of the mob very well. And the thing that he told me that was really fascinating was they noticed two things immediately about the mob: their shoes and their cars. And, we're talking about very, very poor kids, and they were so fascinated by that. And then later on, when my dad was a little older, something happened that was a little more violent, and that brought him to the reality of the situation, which sounds like exactly what you experienced with your father.
Right. Yes, it's amazing what they will do in order to accomplish their goals.
Exactly, ruthless.
Absolutely ruthless.
Were you a big fan of the Sopranos and Goodfellas and all that kind of stuff?
Yes, I was. Years ago, I had a friend who is deceased now. He was a doctor, and I learned a lot of fascinating things from him. His father was a professional gambler who controlled gambling in New York for the gangster Frank Costello. And Frank Costello was my friend's godfather when he was growing up. And this friend of mine had an opportunity to go into the mob, and he chose not to. It wasn't for him, and he eventually became a doctor. But he told me that two interesting stories that were like scenes out of a movie. When he was in high school, his father and Frank Costello showed up one day after class in this big, very expensive Cadillac, and they took him up to Saratoga, where the races take place every year, and which is a tremendous mob hangout. And they gave him $2,000 or $3,000 to bet as he liked on the horses, and he said that was fascinating. And the other experience he had was that when he graduated from high school, he wanted to take his date to the prom, and then he wanted to take her out to the Copacabana nightclub, which was a mob-owned nightclub. It was owned, in fact, by Frank Costello. And he called Frank Costello and asked him if he could have a reservation for that night at the Copacabana. And Frank arranged it. He got a table right in front of the stage that night, and dinner and drinks were on the house for him, and he got to hear a young Frank Sinatra performing that night at the Copacabana. So those are the two stories that he told me.